Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Absolute chaos at the Chinese Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton wins the sprint race in dominant fashion, but a few hours later, Ferrari not looking quite the same team in the qualifying session. Piastri on pole, Norris a little bit back from where he wants to be, and an absolute shambles going on right now at Red Bull, with Liam Lawson already under the spotlight to potentially get kicked out of that seat, given what is going on in the Racing Bulls cars as well. What a drive from Hamilton, however, to start the day. Will that race pace be replicated in the race this evening or tomorrow, depending on when you're watching? Very much on Twitter, your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Let's dive right in. So if you guys aren't aware, I'm currently on Dallas time and I watched this Grand Prix, or the sprint, right, for the Grand Prix at 10 p.m. last night. Quali was then on at like 2, 3 in the morning. So I'm bringing this to you guys in the morning because, you know, it's been a hectic time here. The Chinese Grand Prix is not exactly optimal, but, you know, it was a good time at least to watch the sprint. Hamilton gets away well, leads into turn 1. Verstappen holds off Piastri as well. And it was looking like a decent start for Lando to try and make a bit of a move, but unfortunately for Lando, lap 1 Lando came back in force. Now, look, I've been not trying, it doesn't really matter what I say, but I've been of the opinion that Lando over the last week or so after Australia was getting, you know, too much, I don't want to say hate, but, you know, too much criticism really, when Lando delivered a great performance in Australia and he came into this weekend. People were like, oh, Lando, you know, you should be more humble or whatever and talk about how the car's great and you're awful and all this. And my opinion was like, look, Lando's better than people are giving him credit for right now. This year he looks a little bit more stable and, you know, he's maybe going to be able to actually deliver the championship winning performance that we, you know, maybe expect to see from him in a car that is clearly very capable indeed. But again, and my question is always, when the pressure is really on, whether the mentality is truly there, and I don't really know what he was thinking here, but on the sprint race, he just, I mean, it was the same as last year when Lewis just completely sunned him at turn 1. This was, I mean, a little bit further on turn 6, whatever it is, and he went off the track, he just drove onto the gravel, like, obviously the car didn't really stop as a result, and he lost a couple of places, and he had to fight really hard back in with, obviously, pretty difficult tyre degradation in dirty air to even get back into the points in the sprint race. But Hamilton leads away from the start. Verstappen was trying to put some serious early pressure on. Leclerc and Russell had a bit of a ding-dong that continued all the way until the end of the Grand Prix. This was Piastri at the end chasing down Verstappen as well, because, you know, Verstappen, it was a real masterclass, I think, from Hamilton out front. It's something that we've not seen from him, I mean, recently, because he's not had the car to be able to do it. But Hamilton leads from the front, gets to the front of the pack, and just controls everything, right? Realizes that Verstappen doesn't probably have the pace to pass him. Verstappen did get in DRS 1 or 2 occasions, that Hamilton held him off, and obviously it was going to cook Max's tyres. Hamilton needed to get the laps or the tyres all the way to the end of the Grand Prix or to the end of the sprint race, so he was, you know, just managing the tyres, managing the delta, knowing that Max would probably fall back into Piastri's grasp at some point, and when he did, that's when Hamilton made the move down the road. And by the time that Piastri got past Verstappen, whose tyres were really struggling indeed, then, you know, Hamilton was away and gone. He was, you know, 3 seconds clear and ended the race nearly 7 seconds ahead. I mean, the final lap of the race, Hamilton did something like a 1:37.3. Most other drivers were in the 1:38s. Verstappen was in the low 1:39s, right? So, you know, the tyre deg that Hamilton and Ferrari came up with, and it wasn't, you know, just Hamilton, that Ferrari seemed much better with it on the day, because Leclerc also was able to come back at George Russell towards the end of the race. But it was really a historic drive from Hamilton in many respects. I think that it's such an important race for him to win in the context of his, you know, let's say, journey to Ferrari, right? Because we know that China is a great track for him historically. It's maybe not one of Charles Leclerc's favourites, but last weekend there was even already talk about, oh, well, you know, will Ferrari regret signing Hamilton, or is Hamilton going to regret going to Ferrari and all this? Next weekend, he sticks it on pole, wins the sprint. This is Hamilton's first sprint win. This is Ferrari's first sprint win as well. And okay, it's a sprint, but it's still big points on the board in terms of the championship context that may be critical down the line. It's a very long season we have ahead of us, and it also proved that in the right hands, that Ferrari is a capable car. When they get it right, it's not miles off the pace necessarily as it seemed to be in Australia. So, look, it's Ferrari. They're always going to have a car, mostly, that is at least in the mix for race wins and potentially championships at some point. I think we've seen that so far. And the way that Hamilton already seems to be and getting very much up to speed, because, he's having to adapt his style in qualifying and I imagine to some degree in the race as well to get the best out of this car. Charles Leclerc is a phenomenal driver and has been at this team for many years. The fact that Hamilton this weekend, at least so far, has completely crushed Leclerc, really, and even to such an extent that Leclerc was asking Lewis or Lewis's engineers what setups he was using, and we'll see the evidence of that here in a second, to copy them basically for his car. And that's been helping things, shows that, Hamilton's really getting there, and maybe quicker than even he expected. This was a vintage performance, and maybe a sign of things to come, if the Ferrari is good enough, because, as we saw a couple of hours later in the qualifying session, they're still missing that final little bit of pace when all the cars have the setup rightly delivered, right? Because, the Parc Ferme reopened after the sprint, so the teams were able to make some adjustments and correct some of, what they deemed as mistakes during that sprint session. The other real notable drive from the sprint was from Yuki Tsunoda, because he managed to hold off Kimi Antonelli the entire race, which was kind of amazing for him to pick up a handful of points in the Racing Bull, points that of course he may well have accrued back in Australia, but for a strategy problem. So, Hamilton, of course, he actually called out some of the detractors and kind of said, look, all these people have been yapping about like me and my performance and all this type of stuff. And then he delivered the result that he did last night. And as Hamilton says, last week, for whatever reason, I didn't feel comfortable in the car. I think setup wasn't where it wanted to be, so I'm still sitting back and letting the guys do what they need to do. I need to observe rather than imposing, because maybe what I've done in the past won't work. But coming into this weekend on Monday, I hit up Ricciardo and said, these are the things I want to start with this weekend. This is more the direction that I want to go in, and I'm much happier with the car. And then I think Charles Leclerc went on to say slightly later on in the day that he's been, taking some of Hamilton's ideas with the car setup and using them for his own benefit, let's say when it came down to qualifying, where it was a more marginal gap than we have seen so far. But, lots of interesting storylines already emerging this weekend. But we've got to talk about what we can expect to happen in the actual Grand Prix, because, of course, we know the tyre deg on that Ferrari, and certainly from Hamilton, even Leclerc towards the end of the race, was very impressive, right? It was a concern of theirs during testing, was, maybe not of theirs, but certainly of the fans. It was a talking point that maybe the Ferrari's tyre deg compared to the McLaren's wasn't where they'd quite like it to be. Whereas, it seems like they've got on top of that here in China, a circuit which, of course, is notoriously challenging on the tyres. Q1 gets underway, and we have a very familiar story emerging here in Formula 1. Lawson is out in P20 again. Now, Liam Lawson does not have experience around this circuit, and the grid is much tighter than I was kind of fearing it would be. The gaps between P1 and P20 in this first Q1 session were, barely over a second. It was incredibly competitive from top to bottom, and the drivers that, don't have a great handle on their car, they're the ones that are going to miss out in these type of scenarios. And we do have a very competitive order. Look, could the McLaren be dominant, the most dominant car on its day when it's really in the window? Sure. Is that a bit concerning for the rest of the grid? Absolutely. But, the midfield this year is going to be chaos. And I'm hoping that at the front of the field it's chaos as well. But how it's shaping up so far, Max is never going to go away, but I don't think the Mercedes are quite in the position to challenge the McLarens, although maybe that's not going to be true, because what George Russell's been up to. I think Ferrari need to, turn on the burners a little bit, but I still think they're somewhat off the pace right now. So the front of the field is very interesting, but the midfield, wow, it's a complete mess. And Lawson is P20 again. It's amazing to think about this, because the Racing Bulls got in, both of them, to Q3, and even Max went on to say, our car is extremely difficult. I think that's when you put Liam in the Racing Bulls, he would even go faster. I really think so. That car is easier to drive than ours. Of course, he's not driven it, but he can have an assumption, which I understand. I noticed that when I talked to Liam. But this is already becoming a particularly precarious situation for Liam Lawson, right? Because he comes into this team, is expected, even from like a mentality perspective, to keep his cool, keep his calm, keep composed, more so than many of the other previous drivers. But he's come in here. This year's car, in many respects, seems even even more challenging than some of the previous ones. Max is like the only man really able to tame it, and there's obviously an element to which the car is designed for Max, because otherwise you wouldn't get, talented drivers like Lawson, Perez, Gasly, Albon, whoever, Kvyat, just really struggling. This is maybe one of the worst that we have seen so far as well here with Liam Lawson. And already the pressure is building. I mean, there's talk about, could they put Yuki in the car? And the reality is he needs to start turning it around, because we're only 2 races into the season, but his average qualifying performance so far this season is actually worse than Nikita Mazepin's was back in the day when he first came in. He was averaging a qualifying performance over the first 3 sessions of like a 19.3. Lawson's averaging like a 19.7. So it's a huge story, and even the Red Bull guys are talking about it themselves. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes' time once we close out the session, because in Q2, Sainz out in P15. Pretty big story still emerging, I would say, at Williams right now. It's frankly not a massive surprise of mine that Albon is starting out the season stronger than Sainz so far, in the same way that, Hamilton and Leclerc, Sainz is joining a team where Albon has been for a long time. Of course, he's going to know the ropes a little bit better. I know there was some expectation maybe that Sainz is such a good driver that it won't really matter, but, I've made this point clear over the last couple of years. I think Sainz is a good driver, a very good driver, I would say, on his day, but, not a Charles Leclerc. That's been my opinion, and we'll see how it trends. But I think for Williams, their car is pretty good. Like, it's not, the midfield is a bit of a mess, as we know, but for Sainz to be P15 and out was definitely a talking point, especially given that Albon snuck in at P10. It was close. I mean, it was only 2/10 between Albon in P10 and between Sainz down there in P15. But that is massively influential for the race tomorrow. But yeah, I mean, the crazy thing about Q2, was that Hadjar and Tsunoda were right in the mix. And that racing build is looking really promising, right? It was Lando, it was Max, it was Piastri right at the top of the field. And in the final qualifying session, this is what we had of the day. So Piastri breaks Hamilton's lap record from earlier in the weekend, puts in a 1:30.6. Great lap from him, certainly on the final hairpin. He had a really good drive. The Russell lap, though, extremely impressive. And look, we'll see how the season goes, but the fact that Hamilton beat Leclerc today and beat him in both qualifying sessions this weekend, and given the fact that Leclerc is considered the best qualifier on the grid, and given what Russell did to Hamilton last year, Russell maybe is earning more credit by the day, but it depends what he does in the race, of course. Tonight, it is my time anyway. Norris in 3rd, which is good enough. Fine, but not exactly optimal, right? Like, Piastri takes, I think, his first ever pole position in an actual regular Grand Prix. He's had one in a sprint before, but actually to do it in a Grand Prix is big. And hopefully a sign that we are going to have a competitive championship. Norris is not the type of driver who can just romp away with this title as far as I'm concerned. Verstappen's car is not going to be good enough for him to take a substantial lead at any time. And I know that Piastri had a very challenging run in Australia, but he can really make amends for that. Albon ended up P10. It was Hadjar with a great lap to go P7. I mean, he actually had a really good lap, but it wasn't quite good enough to get any higher than that because the front runner's a little bit stronger, ahead of Antonelli, ahead of Tsunoda. And then Hamilton Leclerc, about 3/10 off the pace. I mean, 3-4 off Hamilton was. Leclerc was about 4/10 off. They feel like there was a bit more performance in the car, but it's interesting, right? Because Hamilton, of course, had pole for the sprint. They made a couple of changes, but so did the other teams. And you can tell, the times are a bit quicker here than they were previously. But Hamilton's lap time here was not quite as quick as he achieved for the original sprint pole, which is maybe a little bit telling of the changes that Ferrari made. But maybe there's talk about, because you can change between the sprint and qualifying and therefore the main race here nowadays with the Parc Fermé rules reopening, that maybe they leaned a little bit more towards a race pace setup, because tyre management in traffic was a big challenge for the drivers during the sprint, as we full well know. And, maybe it was expected that Ferrari's outright pace, once McLaren got a couple of things actually properly sorted, because realistically, the McLarens were the fastest car in sprint quali as well. They just didn't hook the lap up like Hamilton and Verstappen did. Verstappen still gets P4, which is, solid, but during the race, his tyre take is still likely not to be great. I think for Hamilton and Leclerc's sake, they'll be hoping that they can jump Max quite quickly, because if they don't, and they get stuck behind a very aggressive Max Verstappen when Piastri and Norris are driving off into the distance, that could be a challenge, certainly for the, the title situation, which will always be in the back of the mind, even very early on in the season. But it's got to be said, the pole margins this year have been very tight already, and, it's shaping up, I think, to be the type of season that we were hoping it was. Okay, maybe the McLaren's a bit better than might be if you could just choose the car performances. Then if you wanted a phenomenal season, you'd probably make the McLaren a bit worse. But the fact that Piastri was ahead of Norris, and Lando saying that this weekend that he's not really been quite on it, feels like he's making too many mistakes, the car's a little bit challenging for him, makes things very interesting. Now, the concern for Max, again, is that, as Helmut Marko says, maybe we'll make some changes. This is after the sprints. You've seen that the tyre wears worse in traffic, but they said that we'll take a good quali position rather than tyre protection. So, the rumour has it anyway, they set their car up for qualifying, and well, I mean, he was P4. Like, it wasn't phenomenal for Max. It was a good lap for sure. But, like, compared to Lawson, I mean, like, he is wringing things out of that car that, again, might not be possible for other drivers. But in the race, he's probably going to suffer pretty badly with degradation again. And, maybe strategy and safety cars could cause a factor here. And Verstappen even was asked the question, okay, what have you got to do to win, Max? How are you going to come through and win this Grand Prix? And he says, I ain't winning this Grand Prix unless they all retire. So it's not really the thing you want to hear if you're a Red Bull fan. There was also Hadjar under investigation for an unsafe release. I know that people have been summoned to the stewards on that. Thought I'd mention it. Hamilton said a couple of interesting things because the other teams improved after the sprint. They made some changes to their car. Ferrari also felt like they needed to make some changes. But Hamilton says this, we made a couple of changes to rectify some of the problems. I don't know if it's the winds, but the car became quite snappy. Wasn't the cleanest lap. Should have probably been a couple of tenths further up. So Hamilton thinks that there was maybe another couple of tenths in the car, which would have put him, a tenth off the pole time. So, that's maybe where he thinks the car is. And Leclerc thinks the car is maybe 3 tenths off the pace because, of course, he didn't have, the greatest qualifying session. These are the championship standings right now. It's Norris from Max, from Russell, from Antonelli, Hamilton up to P7 in ninth, as is actually Piastri here as well. Albon, of course, after his phenomenal drive back in Australia, is sitting at P5. Even Stroll is still here. So that's how things look at the moment. This was that stat that I was talking about a while ago. And this is why already Liam Lawson's under pressure, right? I mean, I feel kind of bad because I do the Donkey of the Day awards. Well, when I remember to do it, I do this award. And I did it last year. And every time I remembered to do it last year, I gave it to Checo Perez because, it was pretty obvious that he had to be the man. And this year, is it just going to be Lawson every week? It's going to be a really long half a season for Liam Lawson. If, it's going to be a really long 3 races for Lawson before he gets kicked out of the team. What are they going to do, right? Is it time to say, Yuki, let's chuck you in the car? Yuki even talked to the media today and said, because the Racing Bull, he's doing well in it right now. It looks like a pretty good car. Much better than I expected it to be. But he was asked the question, if you get put in the Red Bull, would you take the offer? And I was like, hell yeah, I'd take the offer. I'd put me in that car right now. But yeah, I don't know what you guys think in the comments below. And Marko, again, he says this, that they're well positioned when it comes to other drivers and that F1 is a competitive sport. So, you can read into that what you like. If the underperformance continues, he will be out of the car. Marko, we know, is a big Yuki Tsunoda fan. So, maybe Marko's trying to find a way to convince Christian to chuck him in the car. And Max says, the gap to the best car is bigger than last year. Is he worried? Yes. So, loads of stories of the day. Of course, what happens in the race is going to be massively important to determine how this championship may potentially go, because so far this year, McLaren have been on pole for every Grand Prix, not the sprint, but for every Grand Prix. They've won the first Grand Prix with Lando. Let's say Piastri closes it out in China. Then, every time that 2 different drivers have taken pole in the first couple of rounds, they've gone on to win both championships. So maybe a bit of at least in the 21st century. So maybe a little bit of a sign of things to come there for McLaren, but very much intrigued to your thoughts as always on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.